Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal why Michael had believed he had finally weathered the storm of the courtroom, standing tall with a ruling in his favor and the full custody of Wiley and Amelia now legally his. An unseen earthquake had already begun to rumble beneath the surface, a slow, sinister tremor poised to erupt and shake the very foundations of his victory. The courtroom, once thought to be a space for justice, had instead been tainted by a secret deal made behind closed doors. Judge Eva, the same judge who delivered the decisive ruling that stripped Willow of custody and handed it solely to Michael, was discovered to have accepted a bribe. And the source of that bribe was none other than Sidwell, a man whose name had long been whispered in the shadows of Port Charles, tied to webs of manipulation, criminal enterprise, and a grandiose scheme to take control of the city's most strategic asset, the docks. What no one could have predicted, however, was that the first person to uncover this act of corruption would be Marco, the very son of Sidwell himself. Caught between the blood-bound duty of filial loyalty and the unyielding call of moral conscience, Marco stumbled upon something he was never meant to see. While performing what was meant to be routine maintenance on a forgotten subsystem of surveillance servers tied to the Windmere estate, he came across a cache of encrypted files. Intrigued by an unusual access log and the presence of a hidden camera's feed, Marco dug deeper and decrypted a file that revealed the entire illicit meeting between Sidwell and Judge Eva. In the footage, Sidwell could be seen sliding a digital device across a polished table, confirming that the funds would be fully transferred once the judge ruled in favor of Michael. Her voice, calm and transactional, sealed the deal as she promised to deliver the verdict Sidwell requested, thus manipulating the judicial process to serve his own ends. Marco didn't react with immediate outrage or confrontation. He knew better. Any misstep could trigger an avalanche that would not only bury his father's enemies but himself as well. Sidwell was not a man who left loose ends dangling, not even his own son. Marco had seen enough over the years to understand the quiet brutality his father was capable of, and he understood that acting too quickly or too loudly could cost him everything. So instead, he chose a subtler path, one that balanced on a knife's edge. He arranged for an unannounced, anonymous meeting with Michael, not in person, but through action. In the dead of night, he slipped a device into the trunk of Michael's car. No explanation, no fanfare, just a line etched into the plastic surface of the drive: choose, justice or deceit. Marco, however, didn't stop there. He knew that just revealing the truth to Michael wasn't enough. The consequences were too massive, too intricate, to be handled by one man alone. So he took a bolder step, one that might be interpreted as betrayal by his father and yet felt to Marco like the only path toward redemption. He sent a duplicate copy of the video to Sonny. It was a quiet signal, a subtle act of allegiance to the man who had always stood between chaos and family in Port Charles. By doing so, Marco wasn't merely exposing Sidwell's betrayal, he was reigniting Sonny's protective instincts, long dulled by the weary grind of mob politics and personal loss. He understood that Sonny wasn't just a kingpin, he was a father, a man who would never allow his grandson's future to be purchased like property in a rigged transaction. As the digital files reached their intended recipients, the ripple effects began. Michael, upon watching the footage, felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. The courtroom victory that had filled him with such bittersweet pride now felt like poison running through his veins. He had fought so hard for Wiley and Amelia, believing he was doing what was right, only to discover that his win had been orchestrated by the same corrupt machinery he had once vowed to protect his children from. A rage unlike any he had felt before boiled inside him, not just at Sidwell, not just at the judge, but at the sheer violation of the trust he had placed in the system. Meanwhile, Sonny watched the video with a cold, methodical silence. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to act impulsively. What he saw was a declaration of war, not just against Michael or Wiley, but against everything he had built, protected, and sacrificed for over the years. But this wasn't a war he could fight with fists or bullets. This required precision, calculation, and patience. Sonny knew the game was changing, that the players had evolved. Sidwell wasn't just another rival. He was a force attempting to rewrite the rules from within, poisoning the judicial and political systems while cloaking himself in legitimacy. And now, thanks to Marco's unexpected betrayal, Sonny had the ammunition to burn that cloak to the ground. Marco, for his part, disappeared from view after that. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had chosen justice, and in doing so, had condemned himself to becoming an enemy in his own father's eyes. But he did not regret his decision. For in that moment of moral reckoning, he saw clearly, the real legacy he wanted wasn't power or control, but freedom, from lies, from blood-stained loyalty, from the suffocating silence of complicity. And now, the countdown has begun. The fuse has been lit. What started as a courtroom ruling is about to become the epicenter of an ethical explosion that could destroy reputations, careers, and families. The question that remains is no longer whether the truth will come out, but who will survive its impact. When Michael watched the video, an overwhelming tidal wave of rage and revulsion surged through his chest, twisting everything he thought he knew into a grotesque mockery of truth. The courtroom victory he had clung to, fought for, bled for, had never been a reflection of truth or justice. It was a hollow triumph, built not on morality or righteousness, but on a carefully engineered manipulation orchestrated by a man lurking in the shadows, using corruption as his currency. Michael had believed he was doing right by his children, defending them from the chaos and toxicity that once surrounded their lives. But now he saw it all for what it truly was. A rigged game, a cruel illusion in which he had unknowingly become both player and pawn. Sonny's reaction was markedly different. As the footage played before him, revealing the unmistakable transaction between Judge Eva and Sidwell, he didn't shout or lash out. He didn't storm out of the room or throw something in frustration. Instead, he watched with the cold, calculating stillness of a man who had spent his entire life navigating the deepest corners of power, betrayal, and vengeance. His silence was not born of shock, but of recognition. He knew men like Sidwell, knew the way they operated, how they wormed their way into systems, corrupted them from within, and then turned the consequences into tools of leverage. Sonny understood that if he didn't act swiftly and strategically, both Michael and the children would become the next casualties in a slow, venomous campaign of revenge and domination. Thus, a war plan began to take shape. Not with weapons or brute force, but through patience, precision, and influence. This battle would be waged not in the streets but in boardrooms, courtrooms, and the private, whispered circles of influence that determined who rose and who fell in Port Charles. The enemy had made his move, but now Sonny would answer in kind. And central to that response would be Marco, the man who had committed the ultimate betrayal of blood in order to serve something greater than loyalty, justice. But Marco's betrayal of Sidwell was not simply an act of moral clarity. It wasn't some noble, abstract crusade against corruption. It was personal. Deeply personal. Haunted by the explosion at the penthouse, a catastrophe that had left Michael severely injured and countless others scarred, Marco lived each day with the knowledge that the man responsible might have been his own father. Sidwell had never confessed, had never even spoken of the explosion, but Marco had seen enough, heard enough, pieced together enough to know the truth that simmered beneath his father's silence. And while Michael eventually healed physically, Marco's soul never did. The guilt clung to him, growing heavier with every lie he watched his father tell, with every layer of deceit Sidwell added to his campaign to bend Port Charles to his will. And when Marco saw the footage of the judge, when he saw, with his own eyes, another life being twisted into a pawn for Sidwell's gain, something broke inside him. Not in fury, but in grief. He realized that his father would never stop, would never pause to consider the lives he was trampling, not even the life of his own son. In Sidwell's world, people were chess pieces, and power was the only end that justified every means. Marco had once tried to live in that world, had once tried to accept it, even support it from the sidelines. But no longer. Releasing the video wasn't just about righting a legal wrong. It was a reckoning. A desperate attempt to stop the monster before it consumed everything and everyone. It was Marco's act of defiance, yes, but also an act of redemption. He needed to liberate himself from the legacy that had begun to rot his identity from within. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the reflection of a man who could no longer distinguish where his own choices ended and his father's manipulation began. Exposing Sidwell was Marco's way of carving out a new self, one not born of blood, but of conscience. And perhaps, in saving Michael from a false and poisoned victory, Marco was also saving himself. Because to let the lie stand would be to accept it, and to accept it would be to drown in it, just as surely as so many others had drowned in the quiet violence of Sidwell's ambition. So, with one action, Marco split from his lineage, from the oppressive shadow that had darkened his every breath, and emerged into the blinding, terrifying clarity of truth. Whether he would survive that truth was uncertain. But for the first time in years, he no longer feared being destroyed by his father. He feared becoming him. And that was a fate he would do anything to avoid. Sidwell, the man who had always considered himself 10 steps ahead of everyone else in Port Charles, finally sensed that the shadows he'd carefully manipulated were no longer under his control. The moment he noticed inconsistencies in the surveillance logs and phantom access points within the digital infrastructure surrounding Windermere, a chill crept down his spine. Someone had breached the very system he believed impenetrable. He descended into a frantic hunt, sifting through metadata, communication logs, and encrypted files, desperate to find the intruder. But it was too late. Marco, meticulous and methodical, had covered his tracks with surgical precision. Every trace of his presence had been wiped clean, no digital fingerprints, no corrupted pathways, no backdoors left behind. The information had already reached those who mattered most, and Sidwell was now chasing ghosts in his own castle. As the storm gathered beyond his control, the first cracks appeared not in Sidwell's empire, but in the carefully built facade of Judge Eva. Once confident that her part in the scheme would remain buried beneath layers of influence and plausible deniability, she now found herself cornered. A quiet inquiry from within the judiciary system began to escalate behind closed doors. What started as whispered rumors soon evolved into pointed questions. Every financial transaction she had made in the past year came under scrutiny. Her phone records, travel history, and private communications were being dissected. Media outlets, always hungry for a scandal involving corruption at the bench, caught wind of the brewing investigation. Her face, once known only within courtrooms, now graced headlines with damning subtext. The walls were closing in. Yet while the public clamored for answers and the court prepared for possible internal review, Sonny held his silence. He had the evidence, the motive, and the platform to destroy both Sidwell and Eva in one decisive strike. But Sonny was a strategist, not a showman. He knew that power wasn't just in possession of truth, it was in the timing of its release. A single well-placed leak to the right investigator, a subtle whisper into a reporter's ear, or a discreet file forwarded to a federal oversight committee could do more damage than a courtroom explosion. And so he waited, calmly, like a lion beneath tall grass. Every detail he released would be chosen with care. Every moment of exposure calculated for maximum devastation. It wasn't vengeance, it was discipline, precision, and protection. He would dismantle Sidwell brick by brick, from the inside out, until there was nothing left but a hollow name. Michael, on the other hand, was a man caught in a storm of his own making. The truth had been handed to him like a poisoned gift. He was not responsible for the corruption that tainted his victory, but he had benefited from it, and that made every breath since the revelation feel like fraud. Rage consumed him at first. Rage at Sidwell, at the judge, at the system that had betrayed its own integrity. But beneath that anger was fear. If he brought this evidence forward, if he chose to expose the truth, he risked losing the very thing he had fought so hard to gain, custody of Wiley and Amelia. The case could be reopened, the judgment vacated, and the children thrown back into legal limbo. But to remain silent would mean allowing the rot to continue. To watch the justice system remain a puppet stage for men like Sidwell, who bent morality to serve ambition. The choice was excruciating. Either preserve his grip on fatherhood through a lie, or risk it all to ensure a world where his children wouldn't grow up learning that power always beats truth. He paced through sleepless nights, replaying the video over and over in his mind. The laughter of his children rang in his ears like a judgment he couldn't ignore. In that moment of torment, a clarity began to form. He could not face them in the future knowing he had been silent. They deserved more than a father who won through someone else's crime. They deserved a world where someone stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. But Michael also knew he could not wage this battle alone. For the first time in his life, he found himself needing Sonny not just as a grandfather to the children, but as an ally. Someone with the experience, connections, and resolve to navigate the treacherous currents of high-level deceit. And more surprisingly, he realized he needed Marco. A man he had once dismissed, whose last name alone had made him an object of suspicion, had now proven to be the one person willing to tear down his own lineage in the name of justice. Marco, with his quiet courage and bitter clarity, had become a soldier of truth. And in this war, that made him indispensable. Together, they formed an unlikely trinity, the father who had long danced with darkness but now wielded truth like a dagger, the son who had unknowingly benefited from corruption and now stood at a moral crossroads, and the son of the enemy who had chosen redemption over legacy. Each had their own reason to see Sidwell fall. Each carried their own wounds. But if they could hold the line together, then perhaps Port Charles might still be saved from the poison that had been seeping through its foundation for far too long. The next move was theirs. And it would echo far beyond the courtroom. The legal battle looming on the horizon had long since ceased to be about the custody of two innocent children. It had morphed into something far more profound and perilous. A reckoning between truth and treachery, light and darkness, corruption and the unyielding pursuit of justice. What began as a domestic dispute had unraveled into a grand moral trial of the entire system, a test not only of law but of conscience. This was no longer about Wiley and Amelia. This was about who would shape the future of Port Charles, those who thrived in shadow and manipulation, or those willing to tear the darkness apart to reclaim the soul of the city. Sidwell, for all his calculation and cunning, had made a single, fatal misjudgment. In his relentless quest to dominate the judicial process, to cement his control over Port Charles's most sacred institutions, he had wagered everything, his influence, his reputation, even his own legacy, on a single, corrupt decision. He had believed that the world could be bent, bought, or broken to his will, that power was the only currency that mattered, and that no one would dare question a man who held all the strings. But Sidwell had failed to see the most dangerous variable of all, the humanity he thought he had extinguished in his own son. Marco, whom Sidwell had always viewed as a mere pawn, a spare piece in the grand chess game of power, emerged as the unlikeliest of adversaries. A son burdened by guilt, scarred by secrets, and awakened by a truth too ugly to ignore. A son who had finally chosen to sever the blood-soaked tether that bound him to a legacy of deceit. Marco didn't storm into battle waving flags or shouting accusations. He moved in silence, cutting through the lies with a single, undeniable truth, evidence of his father's betrayal laid bare in front of the very people Sidwell had hoped to control. That quiet rebellion, that solitary act of defiance, became the blade aimed at the heart of Sidwell's empire. And now, with masks beginning to slip, the entire town of Port Charles braced itself for the fallout. The pristine facades of powerhouses began to crack. Politicians, judges, and executives found themselves under scrutiny, wondering what else Marco might have uncovered, what else Sonny might unleash, and how deeply the rot had spread beneath their carefully polished images. The courtrooms, the press rooms, the city hall, they all transformed into stages where decades of concealed sins threatened to erupt into full view. What was unfolding wasn't just a scandal. It was a war of identity. For those who had spent years shaping Port Charles in their image, every revelation was a threat to their reign. For those who had been silenced, betrayed, or pushed aside, it was a long-awaited moment of vindication. In this swirling tempest of ambition, vengeance, redemption, and grief, battle lines were redrawn not by blood ties or political allegiances, but by moral courage.